A novel from the Age of Decadence. The date of Erich von Luttwitz's Feast of Death approached without my having encountered him again. We had nothing more to say to each other and did not wish to argue about our recent differences. Yet to exclude any doubt that our relationship was now of a purely formal nature, Erich wrote to me again and asked me to accept his invitation. There was also an echo of our former warmth in these lines. When I set off, the evening was wet, cold, and even wintry. A biting northwesterly drove dense masses of fog before it. The streets around the Gwendenhaus were even more deserted in their bleak uniformity. One scarcely saw a blurred figure groping its way along the edge of the pavement, where wan circles of sulphurous yellow light formed around the lampposts. The extensive garden, whose last autumnal leaves hid the villa from view, was also deserted, but the subdued sounds of an orchestra told me that the party was in full swing. The windows were, as usual, carefully concealed by shutters so that only a few gleaming shafts of light fell across the gravel path. I had to ring the bell before I was admitted, but then I was standing immediately in the dazzling light of the foyer, which was separated from the vestibule by lavish draperies. A flunky led me to the cloakroom where all sorts of overcoats, top hats, and mufflers were already piled on top of each other. I was, apparently, one of the last to arrive. Then I could hear the music quite clearly coming from the first floor. They were playing Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, the final notes of the last movement, the Song de Nuit de Sabbath, were just dying away. And the musicians certainly seemed up to the task. The shrill notes of the witch's orgy raged round and round with a passionate wildness and fervor. No sooner had the symphony come to an end than another band struck up in another room, presumably a gypsy orchestra from the sound of the violins, which started to play Hungarian rhapsodies. And then, as soon as I entered the vestibule, a babble of voices and the laughter of the guests, who were mostly in the upper rooms, mingled with the music. Many gentlemen were lounging upon the round sofa, strangers, all wearing dinner jackets with white waistcoats, but all of them differing in various degrees. I couldn't find Erich or anyone else who was familiar to me, so I first made myself known to these gentlemen and excited their liveliest curiosity when they discovered that I was a friend of Erich Luttwitz. They wanted to know what I thought of the whole business, whether or not Erich would in fact carry out his intention of killing himself, or whether they should regard it as a prank. I could, and indeed only wanted, to give imprecise information, yet my laconic utterances, remarkably, succeeded in satisfying them. At any event, they fully intended to amuse themselves splendidly. None of them, and only very few of the remaining guests, were acquainted with Erich at all. They were simply a disparate collection of snobs from literary and artistic circles, cashiered army officers, aristocrats with various neuroses, foreigners and bon viveurs from abroad who had come to the party of their own accord. I grew tired of the raucous animation of the gentleman on the sofa and climbed the winding staircase to get hold of our host at last. Upstairs, most of the guests were crowding in high spirits around the buffet tables, the fireplaces, and all the precious objets d'art which this luxurious part of the house offered in the radiance of gleaming candlelight. There must have been something like 100 people, the female sex only sparsely represented, but certainly not without charm. Each of the girls was in some pretty fancy dress costume, and all of them belonged to the upper classes. They were all entertaining the gallant gentleman in a relaxed but modest manner. I spotted Thusnelda, Elvira, and Amaryllis among them. Amaryllis greeted me in a most tender manner and asked me to be her partner. I need, she said, not worry about Erich, who had given them all freedom to do as they liked that evening. I promised to do as she wished as long as she would show me our host. She drew my attention to a crowd of youthful nymphs from whom he was trying to extricate himself in order to greet me. I had prepared myself for a disturbing sight, yet I was shattered to see the facial expression which had blighted those features which had once been so noble. The muscles lay, slack and bloated, beneath the greasy skin. His eyes were glazed and wide open, as if he expected a stroke at any minute. His nostrils quivered convulsively, and the brittle, pale lips were set in a petrified grin. But I saw in everything, and it was this which convinced me, an absolute determination, forced, frantic, and insane. Yet the wretched man came towards me in an extraordinarily animated manner, with boisterous gestures. He was about to embrace me, but controlled himself and shook both my hands, laughing wildly. "We are friends, Just, are we not? We've always been friends." I was close to forgetting myself, losing control, bursting into tears, lashing out, or rushing from the room. I stammered weakly something about, "I hope it's all a bad joke. Keep on drinking," or something similar. But he wasn't prepared to listen to me at all, but started indulging in reminiscences. "Do you remember, old chap, how we stood by the stove in Naples and how we got to know each other because we were freezing? And our journey then? I really owe you so much. The pleasures of artistic experience, the beauty of the body, education, so many manifold interests, so very much." "No, Eric, don't say that." I was overwhelmed by a feeling of genuine, of bitter regret. "Don't say all that. On the contrary, if we had never got to know each other, you would perhaps have stayed in the civil service. You might have made a successful career, the career for which you were prepared, and you might never have entertained that dangerous desire for a way of life that you are not up to." At that, the pride of his race flared up within him. "I am as I had to be," he cried, stamping. "That is, I am ruined, but I would 1,000 times rather live the life that I understand, that I have sampled and can then smash to pieces, than drag a yoke through life like some ox who is driven by someone else." He had already started to attract the attention of the bystanders, who were beginning to sense that something interesting was happening, but at that minute the nymphs arrived and pulled him into their midst. I felt a painful sadness as, deserted, and tormented by useless apprehension, I found myself alone in the crowd which unthinkingly devoted itself to the unusual pleasures of this night. And indeed, they experienced something quite remarkable, and in the grand style. All the senses were satisfied simultaneously, in the manner of Huysmans de Ascent and his principle of accumulated gratification, with the most exquisite delicacies. Whilst the two orchestras played dances, overtures, and potpourris, and young soloists from the Conservatoire gathered small groups around them, the lovers of the fine arts feasted their eyes on the paintings, china, and draperies, which stood arranged beneath the electric lights, intimately and casually grouped together in the boudoir. Everything that was mediocre was now avoided. Eric had known how to gather together only the finest items, studies, and collections from the most talented artists. One saw oil paintings from Liebermann and Exter, sketches by Grenier, and watercolors by Ludwig von Hoffmann, also glassware by Coping and embroidery by Aubrist. The buffets had been arranged with exquisite taste and expertise. One dined whenever one wished, with whom one wished, at small, triangular tables which stood beneath exotic, scented flowers, behind palms or tapestries. All was seductive, uninhibited. I must admit that my spirits rose as I treated myself to a glass of champagne with some pheasant, which was stuffed with quail and swimming in red wine. My appetite was good. I could also not resist those pieces of toast which were spread with 3 delicacies, truffles, lark pâté, and white caviar. It was only then, when I was looking for somewhere to sit, that I was delighted to find Dmitri Teniakovsky, who was also serving himself to the food, whilst an Italian composer was serenading him with variations on a theme by Orlando de Lasso. This artist, a charming gigolo scarcely 20 years of age, got up from the piano and introduced himself. We then sat down together for a communal meal. The orchestras also took a break, and it was delightful for me to be spared the ear-shattering and nerve-destroying benediction of the instruments. Quite naturally, our conversation soon turned to our host's intention to kill himself, an intention which the Italian held as a prank, but which Dmitri took more seriously than I had expected. "Whatever happens," he said, "we shall certainly have to lament his loss. It's a great pity. He was a fine man. 5 years earlier, we might have been able to win him over." "We should put him under lock and key," the Italian cried frivolously. "Then have him admitted to a hydropathic establishment where they could douse him in cold water." "Fortunately, nobody has the right to do that anymore," I said. "You don't cure broken lives in that way." "Well, then for God's sake, why doesn't he take up a bohemian existence? He seems to have artistic tendencies." Dmitri nodded sadly in my direction. "Because he might have done everything, he became nothing." "But only because he believed that everything was too late for him." "Yes, but this erroneous idea is necessarily tied in with his destiny. Even if he started work now, he would only collapse into the most lamentable mediocrity." Towards 11 o'clock, a fanfare called us down to the vestibule where armchairs were ranged in a semicircle before a curtain. Behind this curtain, the rooms had had certain walls removed to form a wide stage. The play was Oscar Panizza's The Council of Love, performed in a lavish fashion. This had recently been confiscated by the public prosecutor, and the author himself had been found guilty of blasphemy on 99 charges and given a jail sentence. When an actor stepped forward and announced the play in a salacious prologue, the audience burst forth in loud and demonstrative acclamation. The author could not have found a more appreciative audience for his work than these overheated drones, drunk with indulgence and lubriciousness, and desirous of draining the last tingling drop of this piquant distillation. As soon as the curtain rose, and the dainty cherubs had excelled themselves in blasphemy and lustfulness, the hall reverberated with gusts of shrieking laughter and wild bursts of applause. When God, the Virgin Mary, and Jesus appeared, a tremendous cry of "Bravo!" was heard, which rose to a wild tumult when the eternal mysteries were caricaturized. The second act, which represented an orgy in the papal palace to the strains of the Missa Solemnis, with puppet show and a ballet of naked courtesans, whipped up the passions of the spectators to a paroxysm of frenzy. Roaring and screaming, they imitated the actor's performance. Chairs were overturned as ladies fled the room. The more devoted members of the audience objected to this interruption and feared that the performance might be terminated. The farce, however, continued unabated. The lascivious titillation remained at its peak. Only towards the end, when syphilis, with mask and makeup, was sent by the devil for the welfare of the human rabble, did a breath of foreboding and horror steal through the exquisite company. After the curtain had closed over this divine tragedy, the wildest bacchanal broke out upstairs, the actors participating. I heard that Dmitri had suddenly been called away, and would have preferred to run away myself had not the thought of Eric's demise not held me back. Fortunately, I found myself amongst an elegant collection of beautifully bound books and poems by Swinburne, Mallarmé, and Hugo von Hofmannsthal. The latter, I learned, was the poet of those lines which Eric had praised before me and Amaryllis some while before. Each room was filled with diabolical uproar. Beneath the cacophony of the instruments which endlessly blared out dance music, there was roaring, screaming, and people dancing the can-can. Nobody knew where Erich von Luttwitz was hiding. Some thought they had seen him during the performance. Others claimed that he was lying, totally inebriated, before a picture of Venus. A search for him began, in all the corners, under all the tables, first playfully, but then with mounting horror. Gradually the house became quieter. The musicians were ordered to stop playing. Small groups gathered, whispering and conferring. Only a few concealed the unbridled thrill they experienced at the prospect of an imminent and terrible surprise, just as the rabble in Rome had anticipated the last fight of the gladiators. Then the rumor spread. Erich Luttwitz had shot himself at 2 o'clock before his mirror with 2 small pistols. Where, was the anxious question. Probably in his bedroom or in the dressing room. Upstairs, then? On the second floor? Someone should go and look. Now they were all very sober and abashed. A few of the girls burst into tears and demanded to be taken home. Other figures made their uncertain way surreptitiously to the door. I sat alone, bathed in sweat and unable to move my limbs, watching the scene. I was listless, in the sober knowledge that the drama was now over and nothing could hinder the unknown catastrophe. Whatever the details might be did not concern me. I would rather not know. Envoys, servants, and guests came back from the rooms on the second floor. Nothing extraordinary had been found. They searched the whole house meticulously for about an hour. Eric Lutvitz had disappeared without trace. It was empty, silent, and dark. The guests departed without a word. One of the last, I stepped over into the fog of the streets.